My wife hired a hitman to take me out, and I calmly watched her game. She and her mother thought they had it all under control, but the ending will be very different. My name is Alex. I'm 29, and if someone had told me a year ago that my life would turn into a living nightmare, I would have laughed, of course. But now, there's nothing funny about it. Everything started quite normally, no drama in the beginning. Sarah, my wife, had always been sweet and caring, but recently I noticed that something had changed. She became distant, lost in her own thoughts, withdrawn, and disconnected from me. It began with small things. She spent more time alone with her phone, left the house without explanations, and even started looking at me differently. You know that feeling when someone is physically there, but emotionally they're far away? That was her. I tried talking to her, asking what was going on, but she always chalked it up to being tired from work or having personal matters to deal with. I didn't push. Maybe that was my mistake. But at the time, I had no idea that things were much worse than I could have imagined. One evening, while Sarah was in the shower, she left her phone on the table in the living room. It suddenly vibrated, and a message popped up on the screen. Honestly, I'd never pried into her personal business before, but something made me pick up the phone. The message was from someone named Nicholas. "It's done. Awaiting instructions." That moment marked the beginning of the end of my peace of mind. I stood there with the phone in my hand, my mind racing with all kinds of thoughts. It's done? Awaiting instructions? What could that even mean? At first, I thought it might be some work-related message, or maybe someone was trying to set her up, but I had a sinking feeling in my gut. Something was clearly off. Usually I don't panic easily, but this time serious suspicion started creeping in. When Sarah came out of the shower, I tried to act normal. She asked how my day was and smiled, but I barely managed to stop myself from asking outright, "What the hell is going on?" I decided to stay quiet for now. I put the phone back, pretending to watch TV, though my mind was racing. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed, listening to her breathing beside me, wondering, what if it's all just my imagination? Maybe I'm overthinking it. Or is something truly wrong? I wanted to just turn to her and ask directly, but something inside me said to stay quiet for now. The sense of danger wouldn't leave me. The next day, everything seemed normal again. We had coffee, chatted about trivial things, but now every word she said seemed suspicious to me. I noticed how she avoided looking me in the eye, how her phone was constantly on silent mode. She acted perfectly, as if nothing had happened, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong, and this was only the beginning. After seeing that strange message from Nicholas, I couldn't rid myself of the idea that this had gone far beyond ordinary marital issues. You know that feeling when you try to convince yourself everything's fine, but deep down, something still gnaws at you. That's how I felt. I started watching her every move. I couldn't stop thinking about what she might be planning, and I couldn't let go of that thought. A few days later, I finally gathered my thoughts. I decided if there were any hidden secrets, I needed to find them myself. Of course, snooping through my wife's phone was the last thing I wanted to do, but I felt I had no choice. I waited until Sarah fell asleep and, like a detective, took her phone again. My adrenaline was pumping, like I was about to crack some top-secret agency's code. This time, I did a thorough check, scrolled through messages, looked for any clues, and that's when it hit me like a ton of bricks. I stumbled upon their chat with this Nicholas. This wasn't just a normal conversation. They were discussing me, as if I wasn't her husband, but just some problem that needed to be dealt with. In one of the messages, Sarah wrote, "We need to make sure no one suspects anything." And he replied with something like, "We'll handle everything quietly, don't worry." I was horrified. I could barely believe my eyes. It didn't make sense. My wife, the woman I had spent so many years with, someone I knew as kind and close, was now planning something horrible behind my back. It felt like a punch to the gut. I sat in silence, listening to her breathe in her sleep, realizing something terrifying was brewing in my home. But the scariest part wasn't even that. I realized she was doing it all coldly, without any emotion. The messages showed no hesitation, just a clear plan, with every step laid out in detail. Panic rose within me. What was I supposed to do? How was I supposed to react? Call the police and say, "My wife is planning something strange?" They'd probably just laugh it off. I closed the phone and went back to bed, but sleep never came. I lay there thinking about how to get out of this situation. Confronting her wasn't an option. She could be ready for that, and I had no idea what she was capable of if she realized I knew everything. One thing became clear. I had to play by her rules and find out more before making any moves. The next morning, everything seemed normal again. Sarah acted as if nothing had happened. She smiled, joked, talked about plans for the weekend, and I sat at the table, pretending not to know a thing, while inside I was boiling with anger. Now I felt like I was sitting on a powder keg, knowing that any wrong move could lead to disaster. But I wasn't going to just sit and wait for her to execute her plan. Now that I knew Sarah was planning something terrible, I couldn't afford to act rashly. It was like a chess game, and I had to think through every move. I felt trapped, sitting across from someone who was essentially planning to destroy me, yet I couldn't let her know that I was on to her. It was a tough situation, and I knew I had only one shot to get out unscathed. I started gathering information. My first step was to find out who this Nicholas really was. It was clear he wasn't just some acquaintance or work colleague. Since he was discussing something clearly illegal with Sarah, he had to be shady. That's when I remembered an old friend, Alexei. He used to work in security and always had connections with the right people, especially in the underground circles. I called him and asked him to look into someone with that name. Luckily, Alexei was a real pro. He quickly found out that this Nicholas was a small-time con artist. His real name wasn't even Nicholas. He used that alias for his dirty dealings. Mostly, he was involved in debt collection, blackmail, and other shady stuff, but what reassured me was that he was far from being a professional killer. This guy had just taken on a job he wasn't equipped to handle. This gave me hope. I realized I could use his inexperience against him, but for now, I had to convince Sarah that I knew nothing. This was the key. If she even suspected I was on to her, the plan would fail. So I kept up the act, while inside I was simmering. Every smile she gave, every innocent gesture, now felt like part of her grand scheme, and it was driving me insane. A few days later, Alexei called again with more information. It turned out that Nicholas was nervous about this job, too. He clearly wasn't sure he could pull it off, and that worked in my favor. If I could apply pressure on him, I had a chance to turn the game in my favor. Now I had a plan. I had to keep pretending to be the oblivious husband while working to flip Nicholas to my side. He was my keycard. Sarah thought she had everything under control, but I had my own tricks up my sleeve. Every day, I woke up with the thought, how long can I keep up this charade? I knew that if I acted too quickly, I'd blow everything up. Too slowly, and I could be destroyed. In this game, I had to play it out to the end, and the stakes were high. After learning who Nicholas was, and realizing that I could exploit his weaknesses, my plan started to come together more clearly. But, as it turned out, I still didn't know the whole truth. Sarah was just a part of this devilish puzzle. The real blow was waiting for me ahead, and it came from the most unexpected source. One evening, Sarah's mother, Elizabeth, dropped by for a visit. She usually called ahead, but this time she showed up unannounced, with a strange expression on her face. Elizabeth never particularly liked me. It was clear from day one. She always thought Sarah deserved better, and that resentment seeped into every conversation. But what surprised me that night was her unusual behavior. Normally, she stuck to her snide remarks, but this visit felt overly staged. She started with light topics, how work was going, how we were doing. But all of it was so artificial that it immediately put me on edge. It felt like her real reason for coming was something else entirely. The more she talked, the more I sensed that this wasn't just casual family chatter, it was some kind of hidden interrogation. Elizabeth was persistently asking about our plans, as if trying to fish for something specific. I realized she knew something important, something I still didn't. The more I listened, the stronger my feeling grew that she was playing her own role in this insane scheme. Then, at one point, when Sarah left the room, Elizabeth, staring me dead in the eyes, suddenly shifted the conversation to something much more personal. She abruptly changed the subject. "Have you ever thought that there might be things in your life you're better off not knowing?" Her voice was quiet, almost menacing. A chill ran down my spine. Those words were clearly a warning. From that moment on, I knew Elizabeth was aware of what was going on. More than that, she seemed to be a part of the plan. There was a certain contempt in her words, as if I was nothing more than an obstacle she and Sarah, were planning to eliminate. My suspicion had been correct. This wasn't just a wife conspiring against her husband. This was a family plot. I now understood that my problem wasn't just Sarah. Her mother was deeply involved in all of this. Maybe it was even Elizabeth who pushed Sarah into these actions, helping her. Or perhaps she had orchestrated the whole twisted scheme herself. But how far had they gone? What else were they hiding? When Sarah returned to the room, I tried not to give away my thoughts. They both acted as if nothing had happened, but I could feel the tension in the air. Their smiles were fake, the conversation hollow. Every word now seemed layered with hidden meaning. It was at that point I realized my situation was far worse than I had imagined. I wasn't just facing Sarah. I was up against her and her mother. Two people who had clearly made me their target. This was no longer a simple family drama. It was a full-blown conspiracy. And I needed to act quickly, but carefully. Now that I knew both Sarah and Elizabeth were involved in this sinister plot, everything had become much more complicated. If before I thought I was dealing with just one threat, it was now clear. I was facing a whole family, team. And to be honest, this realization hit me like a cold shower. I was sitting in my own home, surrounded by people who were plotting to destroy me, and it consumed my thoughts day and night. Each day became a real test. I began suspecting everything and everyone. Every action they took, from a simple smile to ordinary conversations, seemed like part of some elaborate plan. Especially after Elizabeth had so bluntly hinted that I was an obstacle. I constantly had the nagging feeling that something was going on behind my back, and I just couldn't see the full picture. At this point, I started taking more active steps. I reached out to Alexei again, asking him to dig deeper and find out more about Elizabeth. My suspicions were confirmed. She had been involved in shady dealings for a long time. It turned out that Elizabeth wasn't just a strict mother-in-law. She had several skeletons in her closet, ranging from financial schemes to connections with dubious individuals. Bribery, blackmail. She had been living a double life for quite some time. Now it made sense why my presence bothered her so much. I was getting in the way of her own plans. The more I learned, the stronger the sense of looming danger became. I started checking all our shared accounts and documents, and that's when I uncovered the real horror. Sarah and Elizabeth had been siphoning money from my accounts for quite a while. I hadn't even noticed how they were gradually draining me of everything they could. This wasn't just betrayal, it was full-blown robbery, plain and simple. Every time I tried to sit down with Sarah to have a serious conversation, she skillfully dodged the topic. She even started pretending that everything between us was fine, suggesting we go on vacation as if nothing was wrong. You know what the creepiest part was? She was so convincing in her act that someone else might have believed it was all in my head, but I knew the truth. Then, one evening, as tensions reached their peak, Sarah started a strange conversation. She asked me, "Alex, have you ever thought that sometimes in life you have to make hard choices?" I didn't know where she was going with it, but it sounded like a veiled threat. I replied with something vague, trying not to reveal my anxiety, but inside I was tense. It was a sign that she was preparing for the next step. There was no longer any doubt in her eyes, only cold calculation. Now I understood. I didn't have much time left. Their plan was fully in motion, and if I didn't do something soon, the end could come faster than I had anticipated. After that ominous comment from Sarah, panic set in. I realized that everything was speeding towards the final act, and I had no room for error. It felt like they were ready to strike at any moment. But one thing was certain. I wasn't going to sit idly by and wait for my fate. I was ready to fight back. The only question was how to do it without falling into their trap. First, I started acting in secret, knowing that any wrong move could ruin everything. I installed bugs in our house, tiny listening devices. I knew that if Sarah or her mother talked about their plans, I'd have a chance to record it and take it to the police or the media. I also realized I needed solid evidence. Just saying Sarah wanted to get rid of me wouldn't convince anyone. Every night, I stayed up late under the pretense of working in my office. But in reality, I was gathering all the information I could find. I checked all the bank accounts, financial transactions, and found numerous transfers that Sarah and her mother had made to secret accounts. They must have thought I'd never notice, but now I was armed to the teeth. However, even with all the evidence, I knew it wasn't enough. Sarah and Elizabeth were too clever and experienced in these matters. If I simply confronted them with my findings, they would find a way out. I needed something more, something that would corner them with no escape. That's when I remembered my friend Nicholas, who could become the key player in this equation. I decided it was time to find this guy in person. The days of talking through intermediaries were over. I started digging deeper and soon found his address through Alexei. He lived in a rundown apartment on the outskirts of the city, a truly miserable place where no normal person would willingly go. But I needed to go there. I figured if I could either make a deal with him or intimidate him, I'd have an extra card to play against Sarah and her mother. When I first met Nicholas, he was even more pathetic than I'd imagined. He wasn't the professional Sarah had probably hoped to hire, just a small-time crook with big ambitions, clearly out of his depth with such a serious job. I approached him calmly but firmly. "Look, I know you've been hired to take me out, but I have a proposal for you that could change everything." His face went pale. He immediately realized I was onto the whole game. That was the moment I felt I could turn the situation in my favor. I offered him a deal. Instead of continuing to follow Sarah's instructions, he would become my ally. In return, I offered him protection and money. Enough for him to start a new life, far away from this mess. But there was one condition. I needed him to hand over every detail of his arrangement with Sarah. All the records, messages, everything that could prove her criminal intent. At first, he hesitated, but he quickly understood that he didn't have much of a choice. Sarah wasn't going to pay him enough to risk his life for her, and so we made a deal. Now, I had one of the key players on my side, and I knew this could be the beginning of the end for their plan. Returning home, I felt like a chess player who had finally figured out how to checkmate his opponent. I knew now that when Sarah made her move, I'd be ready, and my response would be far stronger than they ever expected. After my meeting with Nicholas, I felt like control was beginning to shift back into my hands. Yes, it was risky, but now I had a real trump card, a man who was willing to betray Sarah and her mother. All I needed was to bide my time and strike first. I couldn't stand by any longer and hope that everything would somehow resolve itself. They hadn't left me any choice. I was going to beat them to the punch. The evening that changed everything came soon after. Sarah acted as usual, smiling, pretending everything was fine, but I noticed her tense movements. Something was off. I could feel that the moment was approaching. That day, she kept her phone on her constantly, checking it every 5 minutes. I knew something was in the works. Elizabeth called her a couple of times, and their conversations were unusually short and quiet. It only reinforced my suspicion that I wasn't wrong. They were going to finish their plan that night. I left my phone on the table and pretended that I needed to run out for some errands. I told Sarah I'd be late, so she wouldn't worry, and I left, acting as if I suspected nothing. But instead of leaving, I parked my car on a nearby street and waited. You know, it was like one of those scenes in movies where you sit in the dark, watching the house, feeling like everything is about to explode. After a while, Nicholas called me. His voice was low and tense. "It's confirmed. Tonight. Everything is ready." That was the signal. I immediately turned on my recordings. Thanks to the bugs I had planted in the house, I could hear every word they said. Sarah was discussing with Elizabeth that everything needed to go smoothly with no witnesses. At that moment, I realized this was my chance. They had already made their move. I quietly returned home, sneaking in through the back door, and began to observe what was happening inside. Sarah and Elizabeth were completely confident that I was still away, so they spoke openly. Their conversation was filled with cold details that sent chills down my spine. They talked about how to erase the traces and how to make sure the police won't dig deeper. This wasn't just betrayal, it was cold-blooded calculation on how to get rid of me and cover their tracks. And that's when I knew. My moment had come. I entered the room so unexpectedly that Sarah froze in place when she saw me. Her face went white, and Elizabeth was too shocked to speak. I smiled coldly and said, "Did you really think your plan would work? Did you honestly believe I didn't know?" They were both stunned. Sarah tried to say something, to explain herself, but it was too late. I held up my phone and played back the recording of their conversation. All their plans, all their actions, I had it all. Then I showed them everything I had gathered. The messages with Nicholas, the recorded phone calls, the financial schemes. It was all in my hands now. Sarah broke down. She screamed, trying to justify herself, but I wasn't listening anymore. This was the climax of our battle. I laid out their options. Either they turn themselves in and confess everything to the police, or I would expose everything myself, making sure the authorities and the media knew exactly what they had done. They knew they were beaten. After I dropped all the evidence on them, the tension in the room hit its peak. Sarah, barely holding herself together, desperately tried to come up with any excuse, but the words stuck in her throat. Elizabeth sat motionless, like a statue, fully realizing that the situation was beyond their control. Both of them were cornered. I gave them one final chance, to confess everything and go to the police themselves. If they didn't, I would do it for them. With every word Sarah spoke, her voice grew weaker. The confidence she had shown over the last few weeks began to crumble right before my eyes. She was no longer the calculating woman who had meticulously planned everything. Now, she was just a scared and desperate person, realizing that her game was over. Elizabeth, who had always maintained her cold composure, suddenly lost it. Her fake politeness and superiority vanished in an instant. She stood up and started blaming Sarah, as if Sarah was responsible for everything. "This is all your fault. You convinced me. You started this farce," she shouted, trying to shift all the blame onto her daughter. And that was the real climax, the moment when the mother, for whom Sarah had taken this step, was the first to betray her. I watched with cold detachment as they both crumbled. The family bond that had once seemed so strong was now breaking apart before my eyes. Sarah tried to defend herself against her mother, but Elizabeth was no longer listening. They were both standing on the edge of a cliff, each trying to push the other over to save herself. That moment was the real resolution. All their confidence and planning fell apart in an instant. Now, I saw that they were willing to do anything to save themselves. I gathered my things, which I had prepared in advance, and headed toward the door. Their shouting and accusations grew louder, but I no longer cared. I knew that in a couple of hours, the police would be paying them a visit. Nicholas, as promised, had handed over all the necessary materials to the authorities, and soon they would be held accountable for everything. A few days later, I got a call. Sarah had been arrested. The police had charged her based on all the evidence I had provided. Elizabeth, despite her connections, couldn't escape either. Her involvement in financial fraud and the planning of the crime had come to light. They both couldn't avoid punishment. And so, standing on the ruins of everything they had tried to build against me, I finally felt free. Their plan not only failed, but it also destroyed them. They tried to break me, but in the end, they ruined themselves. Now, my life was my own again, free from that wretched family that I once thought was so close to me.